The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 7. The Home of Washington. In the year 1758, while Washington was with his troops at Winchester, he met and fell in love with Mrs. Martha Custis. Her home was known as the White House, and here she dwelt in fine style, for she had great wealth. She had a boy 6 years of age and a girl of 4. Such were her charms that men of wealth and rank sought for her hand, but Washington, so calm and grave, and with his way yet to make in the world, won her heart, and they were to be wed at the close of the war. She had heard of the brave deeds he had done, and was proud to be the wife of such a man. So on January 6, 1759, the two were made one. In the course of a few months Washington went to live at Mount Vernon, where he spent much of his time in the care of his own lands and those of his wife. He had a seat with those who made laws for the state, and no man was thought more of than George Washington. Washington loved to be at Mount Vernon, where he had spent a great part of his boyhood, with his brother Lawrence, of whom he was so fond. The house stood on a knoll, and near it were wild woods and deep dells, haunts of the fox and the deer, and bright streams where fish could be found at all times. His chief sport was the chase, and at the right time of the year he would go out 2 or 3 times a week with dogs and horns and trained steeds in search of the sly fox who would lead him and his friends a fine run. Sometimes he would go out with his gun and shoot wild ducks, great flocks of which might be found on the streams close at hand, or he would scour the woods for the game with which they were filled, and which none of those who owned the place had a right to kill. A man who had a bad name and paid no heed to the laws that were made was wont to make his way to the grounds near Mount Vernon and shoot just what game he chose. More than once he had to be told to leave and not come back, but he paid no more heed than if he had been deaf, and was sure to take his pick from the best kind of ducks. One day when Washington was out on horseback, he heard the sound of a gun down near the edge of the stream. He put spurs to his horse, dashed through brush and brake, and soon came up to the rogue, who had just time to jump in his boat and push from shore. Then the bad man raised his gun, cocked it, and took aim at Washington, whom he would no doubt have shot down in cold blood. But Washington rode at once into the stream and seized the prow of the boat and drew it to shore. Then he sprang from his horse, wrenched the gun from the thief's hand, and laid on the lash in such a way that the rogue took to his heels when let loose, and came no more to Mount Vernon. As I told you, men of great wealth dwelt on the shores of the Potomac, and kept house in fine style. They had a large force of slaves, and made great feasts for their friends. One of them used to come out in a rich barge to meet Washington. This barge was rowed by 6 black men in check shirts and black velvet caps. Washington had a coach and 4, with black footmen, for Mrs. Washington to use when she drove out, but he chose to go on horseback. Sometimes he and his wife went to Annapolis to a ball or feast of some sort, where Washington took part in the dance, and all the belles of the day were proud to dance with him, for he had a grand style that made him seem like no one else in the room. When storms kept him in the house, he would read, or spend time at his desk with pen in hand. He was kind to his slaves, and took the best care of them when they were sick, but was quick to see that they did not shirk their work. He knew, too, just the kind of work each one was fit for, and which he could do the best. 4 of his slaves set out to hew and shape a large log. Washington kept his eye on them and thought they loafed too much. So he sat down, took out his watch, and timed them, how long it took them to get their cross cut saw and the rest of their tools, how long to cut off the limbs of the tree they had laid low, how long to hew and saw it, what time they spent in talk, and how much work they did while he sat there and took notes. In this way he found out just how much work 4 men could do in the course of a day, and take their ease. Washington was quick to lend a hand in time of need, and once when word was brought him that the dam had broke loose and the mill would soon be swept off, he ran at the head of all his slaves and workmen, and toiled as hard as they in a fierce rain storm to check the force of the flood. The cares of home and state made such calls on his time and thoughts, that he could not be said to live quite at his ease, and he left his mark, a high one, on all that he did. His crops were of the best, and he sought to cheat no one. The flour he sold from year to year was put up with so much care, and was of such good kind, and so true in weight, that all that bore the name George Washington Mount Vernon was held at a high rate in the West India ports. Quite a trade was kept up with Europe, where all the goods had to be bought that were used in the house or on the farm. Twice a year Washington sent a long list of such things as he had need of: plows, hoes, scythes, horse goods, and clothes for all the household. For these last he had to give size and height, name and age of those who were to wear them. In one of these lists Washington, who had need of a new suit of clothes, said he was 6 feet in height, quite thin, and had long limbs. He was then 31 years old. You will see by what I have told you just how Washington spent much of his time for at least 5 years. They were 5 sweet years to him, full of peace and rest and joy. He was fond of his home, and felt as much pride in Nellie and John Parke Custis as if they had been his own boy and girl. Nellie was a frail child, and did not gain in strength, though she had the best of care. Her death took place on June 19th, 1773, when she was but 17 years of age. This was a sad blow to Washington as well as to his wife. And then all their hopes were placed on the son, who bade fair to be a fine strong man. But he died in the year 1781 at the age of 28. While Washington dwelt in peace at Mount Vernon, war was rife in the land. But as he had withdrawn from those who bore arms, he took no part in it. It was called Pontiac's War, as it was led by a chief of that name. But the Ohio tribes were with him, and the plot was deep laid. Large tracts of woodland were laid waste, homes were burnt, and those who dwelt in them robbed and slain. And so sly and shrewd were the redskins that it was some time ere the white men could put a stop to their deeds of blood. It was in 1760 that King George III made up his mind to tax the folks in America for all the goods they bought in England. The trade was large, and in this way the king could add much to his wealth. But the scheme did not work well. It was first tried in Boston, and set all the folks there by the ears. They claimed that they had the rights as well as the king. They had come to this land to be free, and free they would be. They would do without tea and such things, and dress as well as they could in clothes made out of home made goods. The king next said that goods bought from England must bear the king's stamp, for which a sum was to be paid more than the cost of the goods. This was known as the Stamp Act. The folks in America were poor. They had not the means to pay this tax. The thought of it filled them with rage, and for 5 years there was much talk of the wrong the king had done to those who dwelt in America. On the first day of November, 1765, the Stamp Act was to go into force, and all New England was in arms. At Boston bells were tolled, flags were hung at half mast, shops were shut, and bonfires built. In New York, the act, in clear print, was borne through the streets on a pole, on top of which was a death's head. A man named Colden, whose place it was to serve out the stamps, had to flee to the fort, round which was placed a strong guard from a ship of war. The mob broke into his coach house, drew out his coach, put in it a form, stuffed and dressed to look somewhat like Colden, and marched up to the park, where they hung it on a tree. At night they took the form down, put it in a coach, and bore it back to Bowling Green, where the whole thing, coach and all, was burnt right in range of the guns of the fort where the king's troops were. In March, 1766, the king drew back the Stamp Act, which gave great joy to those who had the good of America at heart, and to none more than to George Washington. But he made it known that he felt it to be his right as their king to tax them as he chose, and this hurt the pride of those who wished to make their own laws and be in bonds to no one. Washington, as did most of those who had English blood in their veins, looked upon that land as his home, and was loath to break the chain that bound him to it. But he did not think well of the Stamp Act, and saw what was sure to come to pass if the king pressed too hard on the Americans. On September 5th, 1774, a band of true men from all the states met for the first time in Philadelphia, and Washington set out from Mount Vernon on horseback to take his seat with them. With him were Patrick Henry and Edmund Pendleton, and as they rode side by side they talked of the land they loved, and of the hopes they had that all would be well. The band met with closed doors. Each man wore a grave face. Patrick Henry made a strong speech, at the close of which he said, "All America is thrown into one mass. Where are your landmarks? They are all thrown down." He said he did not call himself by the name of the state in which he was born, but by the name of the land which gave him birth, then known as the land of the free. Washington was not a man of words, but of deeds. But what he said was of great weight, as it came from a wise brain and a true heart. Patrick Henry said there was no man in the whole band so great as George Washington. The band broke up in November, and Washington went back to Mount Vernon, but not to the gay times and good cheer he once had known. George Fairfax, who had been his friend from boyhood, had gone to England to live, and Belvoir took fire one night and was burnt to the ground. The stir in Boston and in the West, where the red skins were on the war path, made the whole land ill at ease. Troops were kept on drill, and the roll of the drum was heard in all the small towns. Men came to talk with Washington, and to find out what he thought was the best thing to do, and the best ways to drill or to arm troops. It was of no use to plead with the king. He had made up his mind and would not yield an inch. A large force of the best men in Vir gin i a met at Rich mond, March 20th, 1775, and Washington was called on for some plan as to what their course should be. He told them that he thought there was but one thing to do. Patrick Henry put it into words that rang through the land. "We must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms, and the God of hosts is all that is left us." All hearts were full of zeal, and Washington wrote to his brother Augustine that if there was need of it he would lead the troops to war, and risk his life and all his wealth in the cause, which seemed to him a most just one. End of chapter 7.